My boss mocked me in front of everyone, saying, "A promotion? You can't even afford a suit." I smiled and replied, "That's because I just bought the company." His face went pale as the board members applauded my arrival. The first time Leonard Briggs mocked me in front of the entire office, I told myself to let it go. It wasn't worth the fight. The second time, I clenched my jaw and smiled through it. The third time, I promised myself that one day, he would regret it. I had spent 6 years working under him at Fairway Solutions, 6 years of pushing myself beyond exhaustion, taking on extra work without extra pay, waiting for a promotion that never came. Meanwhile, I watched less competent, less hardworking men climb the ladder, rewarded not for their skills, but for their connections. They had golf outings with Leonard. I had late nights at my desk. They had expensive suits and easy conversations. I had wrinkled dress shirts and a boss who barely knew my name unless it was time to humiliate someone. That day, the day everything changed, I had just taken a seat at the long, glass conference table in the executive boardroom. I kept my head down, staring at the cheap wristwatch my father gave me years ago, trying to pretend I belonged in that room. The weekly leadership meeting had always felt like a reminder of where I stood, somewhere below the people in power, close enough to see the view, but never part of it. Leonard stood at the front, flipping through slides on the projector. His voice was loud, commanding. The kind of voice that demanded attention, not because of wisdom or intelligence, but because he simply believed he deserved it. "And that brings me to leadership," he said, turning slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "I've been thinking a lot about promotions. About the kind of people who represent this company. The people who have the right presence." He let the word linger, then smiled. A slow, cruel smile. His eyes locked onto mine. "Take Nathaniel here, for example," he said. I felt every muscle in my body tense. Leonard chuckled, leaning against the table. "Now, Nathaniel's been with us for, what is it now? 5 years? 6, I said quietly. 6 years, he repeated, as if the number itself was amusing. "And you've been asking for a promotion, haven't you?" I nodded, my fingers tightening around the armrest of my chair. "Well," he continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "there's something holding you back, Nathaniel. Something that's keeping you from looking the part." A few chuckles from around the room. I could feel the eyes of my coworkers on me, waiting. Leonard spread his hands. "I mean, come on, people, a promotion? The guy can't even afford a decent suit." Laughter. Loud, cruel, merciless. It rolled through the room, bouncing off the glass walls, filling every corner of the space. I could feel my skin burning. My heart was hammering in my chest. I looked down at my suit. It was old, a little worn at the cuffs. It wasn't designer. It wasn't tailored. But it was clean, professional, and it was the best I could afford. Leonard was still grinning. He had humiliated me before, but never like this. Never in front of the entire board, in front of the CFO, the department heads, the executives. I took a slow breath. And then I smiled. I didn't say anything for a moment. I let the laughter die down, let the room settle. Then, in the calmest, most measured voice I could manage, I spoke. "That's because," I said, "I just bought the company." The room went dead silent. I saw Judith Moreno, the CFO, straighten in her chair, her eyebrows lifting. A few of the board members exchanged glances. Leonard's smirk faltered. "What?" he said, blinking. I leaned back in my chair, adjusting my sleeves. "I own Fairway Solutions now." His face went pale. For the first time in 6 years, Leonard Briggs was speechless. No one in that room knew the full story. They didn't know that 2 months ago I was drowning. I was living in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, barely scraping by on my salary. I had worked myself into the ground for years, watching promotions go to people who didn't deserve them. I had nearly given up. And then, everything changed. My late Uncle Harvey had always been my biggest supporter. He was the only person in my family who saw my potential, who believed I was more than just an overworked office drone. What I didn't know was that before he died, he had left me something in his will. A controlling stake in Fairway Solutions. At first, I didn't understand. I had always known he was wealthy, but I had never asked about his investments. It wasn't until I got a call from his lawyer that I realized the truth. Uncle Harvey had been one of the company's biggest silent investors. And now, his shares belonged to me. At first, I hesitated. Could I really do this? Could I really go from being a nobody in the company to running it? Then, I thought of Leonard. Of every humiliation. Every late night. Every promotion that was stolen from me. And I knew. I wasn't just going to take control. I was going to destroy him. After the meeting, Leonard stormed into my office. My office. Listen, Nathaniel, he started, forcing a smile. We can talk about this, right? I opened my desk drawer, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the desk. What's this? He asked, narrowing his eyes. I leaned forward. Your severance package. His hands trembled as he picked it up. He opened the envelope, his eyes scanning the number inside. You're firing me? I smiled. I think you know the answer. For the first time in 6 years, Leonard Briggs had nothing to say. And it was the sweetest silence I had ever heard. When Leonard left my office, the door shut with a soft click. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. The kind of silence that came after a storm, thick with the echoes of everything that had just happened. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. This was it. I had spent 6 years working under Leonard Briggs, enduring every insult, every stolen opportunity, every time he made me feel small. And now? He was gone. Just like that. I should have felt triumphant. Victorious. Powerful. But as I stared at the glossy mahogany desk, the desk that used to belong to him, something else crept in. Doubt. This wasn't a movie where the underdog wins and everything magically falls into place. This was real life. I had never run a company before. I had never led a boardroom or managed high-stakes deals. Sure, I had ideas, plans, revenge. But now I had something much heavier on my shoulders. Responsibility. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see Judith Moreno, the CFO, standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a sharpness in her eyes. She stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. That was quite the power move. I studied her, trying to gauge where she stood. Was she here to test me? To see if I was just a kid playing king? I didn't plan to humiliate him, I lied. Judith arched an eyebrow. Yes, you did. I smirked. She was right. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, crossing her legs. You just fired the most connected man in this company. You know that, right? I know. He has friends. Influence. He's not just going to disappear. I nodded. I don't expect him to. She studied me for a long moment. Then she leaned back, exhaling through her nose. You've got guts, she finally said. I'd like to think so. A small smile ghosted across her lips. Let's see if you've got the brains to back it up. And with that, she slid a thick file across my desk. Welcome to the real game, Nathaniel. Leonard didn't take his firing quietly. I knew he wouldn't. Men like him never did. By the following morning, rumors were already spreading through the company. Half-truths, whispers, carefully crafted narratives. Nathaniel didn't earn this. He was just lucky. He's going to run the company into the ground. You can't trust an outsider. I could feel the shift in the office. The cautious glances. The sudden politeness that wasn't out of respect but out of uncertainty. People were waiting for me to slip up. To prove Leonard right. I didn't give them the satisfaction. For the first week, I barely left my office. I studied everything, every report, every financial statement, every decision that Leonard had made over the past 3 years. And what I found? Rot. Leonard hadn't just been a bully, he had been reckless. He had funneled money into projects that benefited his friends. He had signed lopsided contracts that locked us into bad deals. He had padded expenses, created a culture of favoritism, and ignored employees who actually had talent. The company wasn't failing, but it was bleeding, and he had been the one holding the knife. One night, around midnight, I was still at my desk, buried in paperwork, when my phone buzzed. A blocked number. I hesitated, then answered. You made a mistake. Leonard's voice. Calm. Cold. Dangerous. I didn't respond. You think you won, Nathaniel? He continued. You think a fancy title makes you powerful? I exhaled slowly. I think firing you was the best decision this company ever made. A low chuckle. You have no idea what you've stepped into, do you? I leaned back in my chair, gripping the phone a little tighter. If you're calling to threaten me, Leonard, you're wasting your time. I'm calling to warn you, he said. You don't belong in that chair. And sooner or later, they'll realize it too. Click. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heartbeat steady. I knew what this was. A final flex. A desperate attempt to shake me. It wouldn't work. But still, his words stuck with me. Because deep down, I knew this fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. By the 3rd week, I had started making changes. Real changes. The old leadership structure? Reshuffled. The bloated budgets? Trimmed. The corrupt contracts? Under review. Some people saw it as progress. Others saw it as an attack. One morning, as I walked into the boardroom for a financial update, Terry Langley, one of Leonard's old golf buddies, was already waiting for me. He stood with his arms crossed, his usual smirk replaced by something colder. "We need to talk," he said. I set my files on the table. "About what?" He stepped closer. "About the fact that you're making enemies." I met his gaze, unflinching. "You mean the fact that I'm cleaning up Leonard's mess?" Terry's jaw tightened. "Leonard built this company." I scoffed. "Leonard built a boys' club. There's a difference." Silence stretched between us. Then, Terry smiled. But it wasn't friendly. It was the smile of a man who knew something I didn't. "You might have the title, Nathaniel," he said, "but don't think for a second that you're untouchable." And with that, he turned and walked out. I watched him go, unease settling in my stomach. I didn't know it yet, but Terry Langley wasn't just another bitter executive. He was about to become my biggest problem. And my first real betrayal was just around the corner. Terry Langley's words stayed with me. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. The quiet confidence. The certainty. The way he spoke as if my downfall was already set in motion. And in a way, he was right. Leonard may have been gone, but his influence wasn't. There were still people inside the company who owed him favors, who had benefited from his leadership, who wanted things to go back to the way they were. Terry was one of them. And I had a sinking feeling that he wasn't just watching from the sidelines. He was plotting. It started with a memo. An internal document I had written, outlining necessary restructuring changes, salary adjustments, management reshuffles, and budget reallocations. It was a draft, something that was never meant to be public until final revisions were made. But one morning, it was public. Leaked. Printed copies sat on desks before I even walked into the office. Some employees read it in hushed tones. Others didn't bother being discreet, glaring at me openly. I didn't know what was happening until Judith stormed into my office, a copy clenched in her hand. "You need to see this," she said, dropping it onto my desk. I skimmed the first few lines. Then, my stomach dropped. The version of the memo circulating around the company wasn't the one I had written. It was altered, twisted, misrepresented. Instead of highlighting necessary cost-cutting adjustments, it made it look like I was planning massive layoffs, as if I had walked in as the new boss and decided to gut the workforce for profit. I looked up at Judith. "Where did this come from?" "Someone emailed it to the entire company early this morning," she said, her jaw tight. I clenched my fists. This wasn't a mistake. This was calculated sabotage. And I had a very good idea who was behind it. I spent the next 3 days digging through internal logs, tracing emails, and pulling security reports. And then I found it. The leak had come from Terry Langley's assistant, a woman named Brielle Stanton. I called her into my office. She came in looking nervous, her fingers twisting together, her eyes darting to the floor. "Brielle," I said, keeping my voice even, "do you know why you're here?" She hesitated. I don't know, Mr. Whitmore." I tapped my fingers against my desk. "Then let me help you. Someone in this company altered a private document and leaked it. And it was sent from your credentials." Her face was drained of color. I didn't," I leaned forward. "Don't lie to me, Brielle. I already know the truth. What I don't know is why." Tears welled in her eyes. Her hands trembled. "Terry, he said it was just office politics. That it wasn't a big deal. He asked me to send it out. I didn't know he changed anything, I swear." I exhaled through my nose. I believed her. She was just a pawn. The real mastermind? Terry. I dismissed her. "You're suspended until further notice. HR will be in touch." She broke down crying, apologizing as she left. But I barely heard her, because I was already thinking about what I was going to do next. Terry wanted to play dirty? Fine. I was about to show him what real power looked like. I waited until Friday. Until the weekly board meeting, where Terry would be sitting in his usual seat, smirking, thinking he had outplayed me. The meeting started as usual, department updates, financial summaries, projections. Terry looked relaxed, his arms crossed, watching me like a predator studying his prey. Then I dropped the bomb. I turned to Judith. "Judith, can you pull up the security report for last week?" She nodded and placed a folder on the table. I turned my gaze to the board. "It seems that we've had a breach of confidentiality." Murmurs rippled through the room. I let the tension settle before continuing. An internal document was leaked. But not just leaked, manipulated. Someone intentionally altered it to spread misinformation and incite panic among our employees. Terry shifted slightly in his seat. Good. He was nervous. I kept my voice calm. After a thorough investigation, we found the source. It was sent from Brielle Stanton's credentials. Judith slid a printout across the table. One of the board members, Franklin Doyle, frowned. "Brielle Stanton? Leonard's old assistant." "Yes," I said. But Brielle didn't act alone. I turned my gaze to Terry. She was instructed to send the memo by Terry Langley. Silence. Terry stiffened. That's ridiculous. Is it? I tilted my head. Because security logs show that you accessed my private files 2 days before the leak. You edited the memo and sent the revised version to Brielle under the pretense that it was final. Then, you instructed her to distribute it. I slid another file across the table. Here's the digital footprint. IP logs. Timestamps. Everything. The board members flipped through the documents. Terry's face had gone from smug to pale. This is a misunderstanding, is it? I cut him off. Then I delivered the final blow. As CEO, I said, my voice unwavering, I cannot tolerate acts of corporate sabotage. Effective immediately, Terry Langley is terminated for breach of trust and misconduct. The reaction was instant. Judith nodded approvingly. Franklin Doyle glanced at the evidence again, then at Terry. No one spoke up to defend him. He had no allies left. Terry rose to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. He glared at me, his lips twisting. You're making enemies, Nathaniel, he hissed. Power doesn't last forever. I met his gaze without blinking. No, I said quietly. But neither does corruption. The room remained silent as Terry stormed out. The door slammed behind him. And just like that, Leonard's second-in-command was gone. I should have felt relieved. But as I sat in my office later that evening, staring at the city lights through the window, something nagged at me. Leonard had warned me that I didn't know what I had stepped into. That I wasn't prepared. Terry was a snake, but he was only one head of the Hydra. If Terry had been this bold, if he had gone so far as to openly sabotage me, then what else was happening that I couldn't see yet? I had won this battle, but I knew one thing for sure. The war was just beginning. Terry's termination sent shockwaves through the company. For the first time since I took over, people started realizing I wasn't just some lucky outsider. I wasn't here to play Leonard's game. I was here to end it. But I also knew something else, this wasn't over. Because Leonard? He was still out there. Watching. Waiting. And I had a feeling he wasn't going down without a fight. I spent the next few weeks reinforcing my position. Surrounding myself with people I could trust. Judith was one of them, sharp, experienced, and fiercely loyal to what was best for the company. But one night, as I was reviewing the company's shareholder records, I noticed something strange. A new investor had been steadily acquiring shares. Not just any investor. A private entity. Anonymous. Hidden behind layers of legal paperwork. And they had been buying up stock ever since Leonard left. My gut told me one thing. This was him. He was trying to find a way back in. I needed proof. I called in our legal team, requesting a deep dive into this mystery investor. A few days later, Judith walked into my office, a thick file in her hands. She dropped it on my desk. You were right, she said. I opened the file and scanned the documents. Leonard hadn't been sitting idle. He had created a shell company, a front to discreetly buy back control of Fairway Solutions from the shadows. If I hadn't caught it in time, he would have been able to force his way back onto the board. I exhaled, feeling the weight of it settle in. How close is he? I asked. Judith tapped the file. He's at 39% ownership. If he hits 51%, he wins. Leonard was playing the long game. He thought if he could outmaneuver me quietly, he could take everything back. But now? Now, I was one step ahead. And I knew exactly how to end this. Instead of confronting Leonard outright, I did something else. I baited him. I leaked false information through strategic channels, letting it slip that Fairway was in financial trouble, something that would panic investors into selling their shares. And Leonard? He took the bait exactly as I expected. Within days, his hidden entity started buying even faster. He thought he was closing in on his victory. What he didn't realize was that every single share he was purchasing was secretly coming from me. Once I had confirmed his control at 50.9%, I called an emergency shareholder meeting. Leonard arrived looking smug, thinking he had outplayed me. I let him bask in that feeling. Let him believe he had won. Then, once everyone was seated, I stood and dropped the final bombshell. I want to thank our newest major shareholder for his investment, I said, my voice calm and steady. Leonard gave a fake modest smile. Then I turned to Judith. Judith, can you remind us of the shareholder conduct clause in Fairway's charter? Judith nodded, flipping open a legal document. Any shareholder found guilty of corporate misconduct, fraud, or ethical violations shall be subject to an automatic divestment vote. A flicker of confusion crossed Leonard's face. What's your point? I smiled. My point is that your past is finally catching up to you, Leonard. Then I slid a file onto the table. A full report on his unethical business dealings. Leonard's face went ashen as board members started flipping through the pages. I had spent the last few months digging up everything. The manipulated contracts, the insider trading deals, the misuse of company funds. It was all right there in black and white. And because he now owned the majority stake, the board had the legal right to vote him out and liquidate his shares. A vote was called immediately. Leonard protested, ranted, threatened, but it was too late. When the final vote was cast, he lost. His shares? Forced to be sold. His power? Gone in an instant. His legacy? Destroyed. Leonard had spent years using his position to crush people like me. And now? He was leaving the very company he built with nothing. A week later, Leonard tried to fight back legally, but he had no case. The evidence against him was airtight. By the end of the month, he was completely erased from Fairway Solutions. As for me, I didn't just hold on to the company. I transformed it. I got rid of the corruption, the toxic culture, the favoritism. I promoted the people who actually deserved it. People like me, who had worked their way up, who had been overlooked for too long. Fairway thrived. And Leonard? He faded into obscurity. The last time I saw him, he was sitting alone at a cafe, staring at a newspaper headline. Fairway Solutions reaches record profits under new CEO. He looked up. Our eyes met. And for the first time in 6 years, he wasn't smirking. I didn't say anything. I just smiled. Then I walked away, leaving him behind. For good. I didn't need to destroy Leonard. He did it to himself. All I did was give him a front row seat to his own downfall. And that was the most satisfying revenge of all.